Hey everyone! In light of the 2020 tennis season recently coming to a close this past weekend at the Nito ATP Finals, I wanted to make a couple of season review videos for the top 5 or so ATP players in the world and sort of look back on how they fared in what was perhaps the most unusual tennis season we've seen yet. For much of this season, we didn't even know if we would get to see any more tennis the rest of this year, following a suspension in early March. However, as a credit to both tours, we were able to get up and running again in August, and against all odds got a very solid portion of the normal tennis season in at the back end of this year. Following the restart, we were also able to get some of the best moments and storylines in recent memory. With that being said, it's time to dive into our season review, beginning with the world number 1 in Novak Djokovic. While many viewed Djokovic's 2020 as turbulent, particularly for the off-court aspect, on the court, some things never change, and all Novak Djokovic did in 2020 was win. 2020 saw Djokovic attain many historical feats, including virtually sealing that he would pass Roger Federer in 2021 for most weeks at number 1, as well as equaling Pete Sampras for a record 6 year-end number 1s. And while he was at it, he also retook the lead in the race for most Masters 1000s between him and Rafael Nadal, as he bagged 2 more this season to bring his tally of 36, 1 clear of the Spaniard. In an played, bringing Serbia the inaugural ATP Cup title, as well as an additional title in Dubai. His victory in Australia saw him reclaim the world number 1, which he would never let go the rest of the year. And all in all, excellent season for the Serb that saw him begin a 26-match win streak prior to the season being suspended, which carried on through Cincinnati before his unceremonious default at the US Open. Of course, we can't talk about Djokovic's 2020 without talking about his default at the US Open. I think the US Open definitely has to go down as Djokovic's biggest regret from this season, as he was riding that win streak coming in, and he was the odds-on favorite considering both Federer and Nadal were out, and he would have been the favorite anyways, but we were either looking at 17-time major champion Novak Djokovic, who hadn't lost a match all year, who just won his first event back with Cincinnati a week prior, winning this tournament, or having one of those tournaments, very rare tournaments, where we got a first-time major champion in the Big Three era. And also, just very early in the year, we'd built up this season to be one of those special Djokovic years where he just dominated, and it sort of did look that way very early on prior to the suspension, and we expected at least 2, maybe 3 majors out of Djokovic, and that obviously couldn't happen with the circumstances being what they are. But regardless, he will look back on that US Open as a squandered opportunity, because for those big 3 at this point, the majors are their priority, and with him being such an overwhelming favorite in New York, it was a golden opportunity to close the gap even further on Federer and Nadal, considering the French Open was looming right around the corner following the Open this year. That being said, I don't necessarily think Djokovic was a lock, especially now in retrospect at that US Open, because in all likelihood he would have seen Dominic Thiem in the final, and I know much of the takeaway from that US Open final was the way Zverev and Thiem played that final. There was no chance that any of them would have beaten Djokovic playing like that. However, I don't think there's any chance Dominic Thiem plays that poorly if it's Djokovic in the final instead of Zverev. And he said it himself in his press conference that his start was so much due to nerves that it went through his mind that he might never get a chance like this to win a major again, considering how dominant the Big Three have been. And I think that frame of thinking is just so different when you're playing one of the big three in the final. And considering how he took Djokovic to the brink in Australia earlier this year, with Djokovic, I think he was playing better at that time than what he was following the restart. I definitely think Thiem would have been in there with a chance to take Djokovic in that final. It's obviously a big what if, but considering how that matchup has manifested itself over the last couple years on hard courts, and we saw it again this past week in the semifinals at the O2. With how much teams improved on hard courts, I don't think Djokovic would have been a lock to win that final had they played, but it's definitely still the favorite. To his credit though, following that default, he rebounded quite well and was able to take out Rome and make the finals of the French. But I do think that his form was quite overrated through clay. I didn't think he was very convincing in Rome, and his opposition wasn't that stiff. But I would say he picked it up for the French. However, I think this is really where his form was overrated, considering a lot of people had made him the favorite with the conditions being colder, the balls being heavier, and this being the first year with the French Open having its roof. And he did look great through the opening rounds of the French, but I think a lot of people really overlooked some of the problems that he was having early in the PCV match in the quarters, and even following the Tsitsipas match, a lot of people just looked at the match not being that long for a 5-setter. But with all of that, I just never bought into him being favored over Nadal here in Paris. And of course, nobody could have seen the final going down the way it did, but objectively as a Nadal fan, I looked at that match a lot like I did the 2019 Aussie Open final, where I didn't think the runner-up really played their best, but the way the champions played in both those matches, I really don't think it would have mattered if they brought their best stuff. It was really just a supreme performance from Rafa on the day. What followed the French Open with the brief indoor season we had, Djokovic just kind of seemed unmotivated, and he wanted to get his year at number one, and after that, I think there were definitely matches where he didn't dig in as you would be accustomed to seeing him do so, obviously the most blatant being in Vienna, and after Medvedev kind of drained him in that opening set in their round-robin match at the World Tour Finals, I think the fight left him pretty quickly there, but I don't think I can read into those results much until next season to say they were indicative of any type of decline or anything of that nature. After all, even without his best, Djokovic can still drag anyone pretty much into a tight situation, and in those clutch, high-leverage moments, there's still nobody I trust more than Djokovic, and it's by some distance still. But up until that point in the fall, I think Djokovic had done a good job of fixing what was his primary issue in 2019, was some of the inconsistency in best of three that we weren't used to seeing out of him in prior years since he entered his prime. And for the most part, I think he did a much better job of minimizing those off days, and when he had them, managing them way better, because last year in some losses like the RBA match and Kohlschreiber match during the Sunshine Double, there were a couple losses like that where he kind of faded away and was willing to let those matches go. And you saw some of that creep up at the end of this year, but for the most part, when he was tested, he seemed more willing to dig in and empty his tank, which we saw in matches at the ATP Cup against Shapovalov and Medvedev, where he seemed winded, but was still able to find an extra gear. Saw the same thing when he was down against Monfils in Dubai, as well as the double semis and finals of Cincinnati. And for the most part, in the limited sample size we were able to see him in best of three, I definitely think that he did a much better job in that aspect in comparison to 2019. And really, it was that consistency outside the majors that earned him his world number one this year, since three different men won the three majors that were played this year. And since both those guys in Nadal and Thiem who won the other majors didn't fare as well outside of those majors, Djokovic was able to distinguish himself as the player of the year this season. So with that being said, I think I would grade Novak Djokovic's 2020 season as an A. I can't give it the A+, because even in spite of a shortened season, I think that he and his fans would have thought another major out of this year would have been feasible. In retrospect, you can't really look at the French and say he had much of a shot, but he will definitely look back at that US Open, and it was unlucky, of course, but I think he'll really rue that he wasn't able to put himself in position to even contend for potentially his 18th slam in New York. And also, he kind of ran out of steam at the end of the year, whether it was mentally or physically, so I can't give it the A+. But heading into 2021, he's going to be the favorite at this moment at 3 of the 4 majors, as he's been going into the last 2 seasons. We don't know if that'll remain the case when those tournaments actually roll around next year, assuming we have a more normal tennis calendar in 2021. However, excellent year for the year-round consistency. I will say that for the lows of 2019 that he didn't have, I don't think he had the highs either. I don't think at any point this year I was just dazzled or taken aback by one of his performances like last year's Australian Open. And yeah, those performances are very rare, but that's kind of what sold me that he wasn't going to have another 2011 and 2015 year this season. I think that his winning streak and great results were more a result of his regained consistency. And speaking of those great results, and particularly the portion of the streak pre-suspension, I don't think I've talked about that nearly as much as I should have to this point. So obviously, this is where Djokovic was playing his best tennis of this year. Started red hot, 18-0, 7-0 against the top 10. A lot of quality. I think that would be his best performance-wise tournament. He was going to take out 3 slams this year. And that's not a shot at Djokovic or anything. A standard, very solid version of him is still going to beat the majority of players across any surface. And it's very admirable that he was able to bring that very solid version of himself on a week-to-week basis, more so than he did last year. But having lived through his magical 2011 and 2015 seasons, I just never saw that guy. But the fact that he was still able to make many people believe that was a legitimate possibility at this stage in his career is just another testament to his greatness, as well as to a very high level nonetheless that he was still capable of bringing. Quite honestly, I don't think any of the big 3 have a 3-slam season left in them at this point. I would think that particularly Nadal and Djokovic would max out at 2 in a year. But regarding his outlook for 2021, the only thing I'm confident enough to say is that I think he'll win in Australia again next year, and I would back him to finish number 1 next year and break that record for number 1 finishes, just because I still trust Nadal and Djokovic in their second prime per se. in their 30s. I still trust their consistency more than the teams, Medvedevs and Tsitsipas's of the world. But that pretty much wraps up my 2020 season review for Novak Djokovic. Can't really get too bogged down about a year where you came away as the best player in the world and another major title. So congratulations to Novak Djokovic on a great year, and for those of you that watched, I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and with that, I am out.